The fleet emerged from the warp corridor with the silent, terrible grace of apex predators. Thousands of ships, all obsidian hulls and jagged edges, slid into the void above a blue and green planet the local primitives called Earth. From the command bridge of the Sovereign of Ash, the flagship of the Vorthan Imperial Armada, the world looked like a ripe fruit, swollen with resources and teeming with a labor force that would be perfect for the core mines. High Commander Thralk, a being whose species had long since replaced flesh, with a gleaming black carapace of bioforged alloy, regarded the planet with cold, calculating sensors. His mandibles clicked in quiet satisfaction. This was a Category 3 subjugation. Minimal resistance was anticipated. The pre-invasion scans had shown a species fractured into hundreds of nation-states, still reliant on chemical propulsion for their spacefaring, and with a planetary defense network that was, by Vorthan standards, laughable. The first wave was a formality. Atmospheric burners descended, seeding the upper atmosphere with a localized electromagnetic pulse designed to blanket a continent. Cities went dark. Communication grids screamed into static. It was a standard opening move, a display of overwhelming technological superiority meant to shatter morale before a single ground trooper disembarked. Thralk watched the darkness spread across the night side of the planet, a creeping blot of silence. He had overseen the subjugation of 14 worlds. This one would be no different. The initial reports from the surface, however, were anomalous. A ground commander, a lesser officer of the 6th Assault Legion, sent a status update. It was marked with a priority code Thralk had never seen used in a Category 3 operation. High Commander, the officer's voice crackled, a synthesized rasp over the comm. The subjugation of the primary landmass is not proceeding to standard timeline. Explain, Thralk demanded, his own voice a low thrum that vibrated through the bridge's deck plating. The primitives did not cower, Commander. They did not pray. They did not flee in organized chaos, as per the tactical annex of the Imperial Subjugation Manual. What did they do? There was a pause, filled with the sound of distant, percussive booms from the officer's location. They came for us. Not in organized military formations initially. They came as individuals, as groups, with projectile weapons, with blades, with their bare appendages. They focused our atmospheric burners. We lost 3 to localized surface-to-air countermeasures that were not present in the pre-invasion scans. They appear to have been hidden, not in military installations, in barns, in civilian warehouses. Thralk felt a flicker of what might have been annoyance in his organic core. Unorthodox resistance was not uncommon. It was usually the desperate, futile thrashing of a doomed species. Deploy the Annihilator-class walkers. Level the primary population centers as a demonstration. Their morale will break. Yes, High Commander. The feed cut. Thralk turned his attention to the broader orbital picture. The planet's scattered defense fleets, pitiful things of a few dozen vessels each, were launching. They were not attempting to engage the Armada directly. Instead, they were burning hard for the warp corridor's emergence point. It was a baffling tactic. The corridor was a one-way exit from their faster-than-light travel. They couldn't re-enter it here. It was as if they were trying to run past the Vorthan fleet, to escape into the void. It was illogical. He dispatched a squadron of frigates to intercept, a trivial expenditure of resources. They were to disable the fleeing vessels, not destroy them. A captured enemy was a source of intelligence. The frigates blinked away, and Thralk's focus returned to the planet. He brought up a global tactical overlay. The second wave, the walkers, and the main ground force was descending. And then the reports began to change in tone. The first Annihilator walker to enter a major city was not destroyed by any weapon the Vorthan had catalogued. It was dismantled. The feed from its cockpit, corrupted by electromagnetic interference, showed humanoid figures swarming it, not with guns, but with tools. They had cut through its leg joints with what looked like portable plasma cutters, weapons the Vorthen had deemed them too primitive to possess. The walker toppled, and the feed died. Another walker, deployed to a coastal metropolis, simply vanished. Its last signal showed it wading into a bay, its sensor logs filled with a swarm of fast-moving, small submersible contacts that had latched onto its hull. Thrall's annoyance was curdling into something he did not recognize. He accessed the wider Imperial datanet, a repository of all subjugated species tactics. Nothing matched. These humans were not fighting to defend territory in a way his tactical algorithms understood. They were fighting with a focused, granular efficiency that targeted weaknesses. They weren't meeting the Vorthen in open battle. They were ambushing, scavenging, and adapting with a speed that defied their supposed technological level. A priority signal from the ground forces commander came through, his voice stripped of its earlier professional calm. "High Commander, we are requesting immediate orbital fire support on our own coordinates. We have been drawn into tunnel networks beneath a population center. They are not military tunnels. They are transportation. They know them. We do not. They are collapsing sections behind us and attacking from every egress point. Our casualty rate is 30% and rising. Orbital fire support is denied," Thrall said, his core processors working furiously. "We require the infrastructure intact. Withdraw and establish a perimeter. We will initiate a systematic saturation bombardment from high altitude. Their tunnels will become their tombs." The withdrawal order was given. It was the first time in the history of the Vorthen Empire that a Category 3 subjugation had required a tactical withdrawal. As the Vorthen forces pulled back to their landing zones, burning the land around them to create a buffer, Thrall received a final strange communication. It was not from his own forces. It was a planetary-wide broadcast, originating from a source his ship's formidable cyber warfare suite could not immediately pin down. It was a simple audio signal, repeating on a loop. It was in the Vorthen language, translated with a clumsy but unmistakable accuracy. "You should have read the file. You chose the wrong species. Run." Thrall dismissed it as psychological warfare, a last, desperate attempt to sow doubt. But as he watched his forces consolidate into defensive perimeters, surrounded by a world that had gone quiet, the word echoed in his threat assessment matrices. "Run." It was a command, a warning. And for the first time in his centuries of conquest, High Commander Thrall of the Vorthen Imperial Armada felt the cold tendrils of a sensation he had only ever witnessed in his prey: fear. The silence after the initial invasion was not the silence of submission. It was the silence of a hive that had been kicked, a moment of stunned pause before the swarm mobilized with a singular, vengeful purpose. The Vorthen, confident in their orbital supremacy, had established a primary encampment on what their maps identified as the North American continent. It was a fortified grid of alloy, shield generators, and troop barracks, a scar of alien metal on the landscape. They believed their perimeter was impenetrable. They were operating under the core assumption of all galactic conquerors, that a species' capacity for war was defined by its technology. The humans had never believed that. While the Vorthen consolidated, a different kind of war was being waged in the shadows. The pulse that had silenced the cities had not silenced the people. It had, in fact, unleashed them. Prepper communities, long dismissed as paranoid fantasists, became forward operating bases. University engineering departments, their clean labs now lit by the flicker of diesel generators, became reverse engineering workshops overnight. They had the wreckage of 3 Annihilator walkers and dozens of smaller Vorthen drones, their power core still humming with a strange blue-white light. Humanity had always excelled at taking things apart to see how they worked. Now, their survival depended on putting them back together wrong. The first coordinated human counterattack did not come at dawn or under cover of artillery. It came 3 weeks after the Vorthen established their beachhead, and it came from below. A network of old storm drains, subway tunnels, and natural cave systems, charted by hobbyists and urban explorers for decades, became a highway. The Vorthen perimeter, designed to repel a conventional military assault from the surface, was utterly blind to the earth beneath it. Explosive charges, not made of military-grade composites, but of agricultural fertilizer and diesel fuel stabilized with a catalyst derived from a Vorthen power core's runoff, were placed at precise structural points. When they detonated simultaneously, the ground beneath the Vorthen encampment did not simply shake. It liquefied. The alloy grid, the shield generators, the neat rows of barracks, they all tilted, collapsed, and were swallowed by a sudden, man-made sinkhole. The Vorthen were not warriors who fought in mud and darkness. They were masters of sterile, technological warfare. Thrown into a pit of churning earth and water, their exosuits fouled, their combs disrupted by the very rock that now entombed them. They were easy prey for the humans who emerged from the tunnels. Armed with shotguns, scavenged Vorthen blades, and a cold, methodical fury. High Commander Thralk watched the feeds from the encampment die one by one. He had been wrong. This was not a Category 3 subjugation. It was not a subjugation at all. He was looking at a species that was conducting a war of extinction against his expeditionary force. He ordered a full orbital bombardment of the area around the sinkhole, a scorched earth policy to deny the humans any further salvage. The Sovereign of Ash's main batteries cycled, and beams of concentrated antimatter lanced down, turning a 5-mile radius to glass. It was a display of power that would have broken any of the previous 14 worlds. It did not break Earth. It only confirmed to the humans that the enemy in the sky could be hurt, that they could be made to lash out in desperation. The Vorthen situation deteriorated rapidly after that. Their supply lines from orbit were targeted not by human military vessels, but by civilian spacecraft retrofitted with Vorthen power cores and a single, massive kinetic weapon, a reinforced asteroid mining drill. A human pilot, a woman who had spent 20 years hauling ice from the rings of Saturn, flew her ship the Pegasus on a collision course with a Vorthen supply frigate. The frigate's point defense systems, designed to track and destroy fighter-sized craft, could not compute a trajectory that was so simple, so brutally direct. A Pegasus's drill, spinning at maximum velocity, punched through the frigate's hull, detonating its own volatile cargo and the frigate's magazine in a fireball that lit up the night side of the planet. The loss of the frigate was a strategic blow, but the manner of its destruction was a psychological one. It told the Vorthen that the humans were willing to sacrifice everything. They had no concept of surrender. They were not fighting to negotiate or to preserve their civilization in some diminished form. They were fighting to ensure the Vorthen did not leave Earth's orbit alive. Thralk began to analyze the human data stream, sifting through the debris of their global network that his cyber warfare units had managed to salvage before the pulse. He was searching for a weakness, a political faction to exploit, a cultural pressure point. What he found instead was a history that made his core processor stall. He found records of countless wars fought, with a ferocity that made the Vorthen's own conquests seem like border skirmishes. He found a species that had perfected the art of killing itself, inventing new and more efficient methods for millennia. They had built weapons that could end their own world in an hour, and then, instead of using them, had spent generations terrified of their own creation. They had looked into the abyss of their own annihilation and had chosen to step back. But the Vorthen had now given them an external enemy. They had given them a unifying purpose. The fear that had once been directed inward, the immense, destructive potential that had been chained by treaties and mutual assured destruction, was now focused outward with a clarity that was terrifying. A new transmission was intercepted. It was not a planetary broadcast this time. It was directed specifically at the Sovereign of Ash, a tight beam signal that cut through the jamming. A human face appeared on the bridge's main view screen. It was an older male, his face weathered, his eyes calm. He wore a simple uniform with no insignia. "Commander Thralk," he said, and the Vorthan leader was startled to hear his own name spoken with such casual familiarity. "My name is General Marcus Cole. I'm the commander of what you'd call the Unified Terran Defense Force. You've made a critical error. You looked at our technology and thought you understood us. You don't. You're not fighting a species that just invented spaceflight. You're fighting a species that spent its entire existence learning how to kill anything that threatens it, up to and including itself. You have our attention now, and we are very, very good at this. Our offer for you to run is still on the table. It expires in 12 of your standard hours." The screen went black. Thralk sat in the silence of his command bridge, the cold fear now a solid, heavy mass in his chest. He looked at his tactical display. His ground forces were decimated. His supply lines were severed. And the humans had just given him a deadline. For the first time in the history of the Vorthan Empire, a high commander was considering a tactical retreat from a species he had been sent to subjugate. He did not know it yet, but the decision was no longer his to make. The 12-hour ultimatum was not a gesture of mercy. It was a countdown. While Thralk deliberated, the Unified Terran Defense Force, a coalition that had formed with a speed that defied all pre-invasion political logic, was preparing its final move. The Vorthan fleet, still formidable in its orbital position, was a wasp's nest that needed to be burned. The scattered human warships, reinforced by the captured and retrofitted Vorthan technology, were not gathering for a single decisive battle. They were positioning themselves for something far more insidious. General Marcus Cole understood the fundamental asymmetry of the conflict. Humanity could not match the Vorthan in a stand-up fleet engagement. They did not have the numbers, the shielding, or the raw firepower. What they had was an intimate, brutal understanding of the enemy's supply chain, their communication protocols, and their tactical doctrines, all painstakingly learned from the salvaged wrecks and the interrogation of the few Vorthan prisoners who had been taken alive. The prisoners had been a challenge. The Vorthan bioforged carapace was designed to resist physical torture, and their neural conditioning was resistant to psychological manipulation. But humanity had an ancient tool for such situations: the truth. They did not interrogate the prisoners. They showed them the feeds from Earth. They showed them the sinkhole, the fallen walkers, the burning supply frigate. They showed them the thousands of human volunteers, from retired demolition experts to chemistry professors, who were building weapons in basements and garages. They showed them the coordinated global resistance, a planet united not by a single government, but by a singular primal instinct: defiance. They did not ask for information. They simply explained to their captives, in calm, precise terms, that the Vorthan were going to lose. And then they asked them a single question: do you want to live? By the time the ultimatum expired, Thralk had made his decision. He ordered a strategic withdrawal. The fleet would regroup at the warp corridor's emergence point and return to the Empire for reinforcements. It was a tactical setback, not a defeat. That was what he told himself. But as his fleet began to maneuver, turning their prows toward the void, the trap was sprung. It did not begin with weapons fire. It began with a signal, a complex layered code that the Vorthan ship's automated systems recognized as a legitimate Imperial command override. It was not, of course. It was a fabrication, built from the scraps of code salvaged from their own downed ships, refined by human programmers who had spent sleepless nights reverse engineering an alien operating system. The signal did not shut down the Vorthan ships. It did something far more chaotic. It flooded their internal communication networks with a Priority 1 evacuation order for their own fleet. But the order was contradictory, specifying different rally points for different ship classes. On the bridge of the Sovereign of Ash, Thralk watched in horror as his perfectly disciplined fleet began to fragment. Cruisers moved to one coordinate, destroyers to another. Frigates, receiving conflicting data from their own compromised systems, hesitated. The elegant, predatory formation dissolved into a confused, sprawling mass. And into that confusion, humanity launched its final, terrible weapon. It was not a fleet. It was a swarm. Every space-capable vessel humanity possessed, the retrofitted military ships, the mining corvettes, the civilian yachts with Vorthan power cores welded into their hulls. Even the orbital cargo barges loaded with explosives accelerated toward the disoriented Vorthan fleet. There were no tactics, no formations. It was a simple, overwhelming charge. The Vorthan point defense systems, designed to engage a handful of high-value targets, were overwhelmed by the sheer number of incoming contacts. They shot down dozens, then hundreds. But for every ship they destroyed, 10 more took its place. The Pegasus had shown the way. These were not warships. They were projectiles. The human vessels did not fire missiles or energy beams. They simply flew, at maximum acceleration, into the Vorthan ships. Each impact was a kill. A converted fuel tanker slammed into the engineering section of a Vorthan cruiser, turning it into an expanding cloud of debris. A squadron of civilian atmospheric flyers, never designed for the void, were launched from a hidden lunar base, their cockpits empty, their flight paths pre-programmed, each one carrying a warhead made from a captured Vorthan power core set to overload. They peppered the Vorthan flagship's shields, not to breach them, but to drain them, to occupy its defensive systems while the heavier blows came in. Thralk gave the order for the Sovereign of Ash to jump to the warp corridor, to abandon the rest of the fleet. It was the most dishonorable act of his life. As his ship's engines flared, tearing a hole in the fabric of space, he looked back at the tactical display. The last thing he saw was a human vessel, an old, scarred ship of the line that had been the pride of their tiny navy a century ago, the Defiant, making a direct run at the Vorthan fleet's command and control relay station. The Defiant did not have the speed or the maneuverability to evade the final desperate shots from the dying Vorthan ships. It didn't need to. It took the hits, its hull buckling, its internal fires venting into space, and it kept going. Its final act was to ram the relay station, wiping out the last vestiges of Vorthan coordination in the system. The Sovereign of Ash translated into the warp corridor, leaving behind a graveyard of its own fleet and a world that had proven itself to be something far more dangerous than a primitive backwater. Thralk was in full retreat, his armada shattered, his reputation in ashes. But as the ship's computers calculated the journey back to the Imperial core, a new, chilling thought took hold. He had run. He had done exactly what the humans had told him to do. He was carrying something back with him, something more dangerous than any weapon. He was carrying the knowledge of what humanity was. He was carrying the seed of a story that would spread through the Empire. A story about a world where the prey had become the predator. A story that, he realized with a cold, sinking dread, might not end with his escape, but with the Empire learning a lesson it had never had to learn before. Some species were not meant to be conquered. Some species, if you gave them a reason, would come for you. The Vorthan Empire was a civilization built on the axiom of uncontested supremacy. Its power was not just military. It was psychological. The fear of the Imperial Armada preceded it, ensuring that most worlds surrendered before a single shot was fired. The concept of defeat, of a species that not only resisted but triumphed, was an anomaly so profound it had threatened the very fabric of the Empire's existence. High Commander Thralk returned to the core worlds in a ship that was a scarred monument to failure. He was stripped of his command. His bioforged carapace ceremonially cracked as a mark of disgrace and subjected to the deepest, most exhaustive debriefing in Imperial history. The Imperial High Council listened to his report in stunned silence. He spoke of the primitive world with its fractured nations and chemical rockets. He spoke of the initial textbook invasion that had devolved into a chaotic slaughter. He spoke of the sinkhole that had swallowed an armored legion, of the supply frigate felled by a mining ship, of the final, desperate swarm of civilian vessels that had torn apart the most powerful fleet in the galaxy. He spoke, with a trembling he could not control, of the human who had given him an ultimatum, a deadline to run, and of the look in that human's eyes, a look that was not triumphant, but patient. It was the look of a species that knew, with absolute certainty, that the confrontation was not over. The Council's reaction was not one of fear, but of denial. They declared Thralk's account to be the ravings of a compromised commander, his sensor data corrupted, his conclusions the product of a flawed organic core. They ordered the quarantine of all data related to the Earth expedition. A new fleet was assembled, larger, more powerful, commanded by a decorated admiral of the third expansion wave, a being whose loyalty to Imperial doctrine was absolute. This time, there would be no mistakes. The planet would not be subjugated. It would be cleansed. A single devastating barrage from a new class of super dreadnought would reduce the human homeworld to a cinder. The lesson would be clear. Defiance of the Vorthan Empire was met not with conquest, but with annihilation. The fleet, 2,000 ships strong, spearheaded by the colossal dreadnought Inevitable, made the transit to the Sol system. They emerged from the warp corridor, weapons primed, sensors sweeping. The system was quiet. Too quiet. The orbital debris from the previous battle had been cleared. The human ships, what few had survived, were nowhere to be seen. Admiral Vex, a creature of pure, unyielding logic, took this as a sign of submission. The primitives had seen the might of the new fleet and had fled or were cowering on their planet. He ordered the Inevitable to take up a position over Earth's northern pole and began the firing sequence for the planetary cleanser. The weapon was a marvel of Vorthan engineering, a focused beam of gravitic energy designed to tear a planet's crust apart, venting its core into space. The firing sequence was complex, requiring the ship to hold a precise, immobile position for several minutes. As the countdown began, the Inevitable's long-range sensors detected a single, unidentified contact. It was small, moving fast, and had emerged from behind the planet's moon. It was not a human vessel. It was something else, something that did not match any profile in the Imperial database. Admiral Vex dismissed it. A scout, perhaps. A probe. It was of no consequence compared to the might of his armada. The contact did not approach the fleet. It stopped at a precise coordinate in the void, a point that Vex's tactical officers identified as the nexus of the system's primary asteroid belt. And then it began to broadcast. It was a simple, repeating message on all known Vorthan frequencies in flawless Imperial Vorthan. It was not a threat. It was a history lesson. The message detailed, with chilling neutrality, the history of human conflict. It spoke of wars that had extinguished millions, of weapons that could end a world, of a species that had spent its existence on the brink of its own self-annihilation. It concluded with a single quiet statement. You are not the first empire to mistake our peace for weakness. You will not be the last to learn the difference. Admiral Vex ordered the message silenced and the contact destroyed. But as his frigates moved to comply, the human race showed the true extent of their preparation. The contact was not a weapon. It was a trigger. The moment the Vorthan ships moved toward it, the asteroid belt came alive. The previous human resistance, the swarm attacks, the salvage operations, it had all been a feint. For the years since the first invasion, humanity had not just been rebuilding. They had been building. The asteroids of the belt, countless chunks of rock and metal, had been hollowed out, fitted with salvaged Vorthan drives, and packed with the one resource humanity had in abundance, nuclear warheads. Tens of thousands of them, the legacy of the Cold War, repurposed and enhanced with Vorthan power core technology. The belt was not a field of debris. It was a minefield of planetary scale. The single contact's broadcast was the arming signal. As the Vorthan fleet spread out, their formations disrupted by the need to hunt down a single, fleeing scout, the asteroids began to move. They were not guided with precision. They didn't need to be. They were fired, like a shotgun blast, into the heart of the Vorthan armada. The inevitable, locked in its firing sequence and unable to maneuver, took 3 direct hits. Its shields, designed to withstand focused energy weapons, buckled under the kinetic impact of objects the size of small cities. The third impact cracked the dreadnought's hull, and the subsequent detonation of its own planetary cleanser's power core turned flagship into a short-lived star. The rest of the fleet fared no better. The sudden, overwhelming barrage of kinetic and nuclear fire from every direction shattered their formations. Ships collided with each other, blinded by the light of 1,000 simultaneous detonations. The Vorthan, masters of clean technological warfare, found themselves in a chaos they could not process. A battle fought with the most primitive and brutal of tools: mass, speed, and fire. Their fleet, the largest ever assembled for a single subjugation, was annihilated in less than an hour. Back on Earth, General Marcus Cole, now the de facto leader of the human species, watched the fireworks from a bunker in the mountains. He did not celebrate. He understood that what they had just done was not an ending, but a beginning. They had defeated 2 fleets. The Empire had 1,000 more. They had bought time, but they had also sent a message far more potent than any ultimatum. They had shown that they were not a species to be conquered. They were a species that, when provoked, would turn its own worst impulses, its capacity for destruction, its stubborn defiance, its willingness to sacrifice everything into a weapon that no Galactic Empire had ever faced, the scout ship that had triggered the trap. A tiny one-person craft, piloted by a volunteer who knew it was a one-way mission, did not attempt to flee. It broadcast one final message on a tight beam, directed not at the dying fleet, but at the warp corridor, where it would eventually be picked up by Imperial listening posts. It was a simple 3-word message, spoken in the calm, patient voice of the human pilot. We know where. The message was a promise. The Vorthan Empire had come to humanity's doorstep. Now, humanity had the ships, the technology, and most importantly, the reason to return the visit. The war was not over. It had only just begun, and the hunters had become the hunted. The galaxy, for the first time in its history, was about to learn what it meant to be the prey of a species that had perfected the art of war on itself.